Hi, everybody. It's good to see you, sort of. Welcome to Odd Week Sunday School. Our lesson today is from Paul's letter to the Philippians. It's in chapter 2, verses 1 to 13, if you want to fetch your Bible. Philippians 2, 1 to 13. This is a lesson on Christ-like humility. So raise your hand if you're proud of being humble. Let's think about this. The letter is from the passage is from Paul's letter to the church at Philippi. That was an important city in northern Greece, in the country known as Macedonia, a busy city. It's said to be Paul's sort of favorite congregation, if he had a favorite. We can sort of tell that because the tone of it is, you could say, less frustrated than the letters certainly to the Galatians and the letters to the Corinthians. So the tone is a little different. It's very encouraging and exhorting them to basically keep on doing what they've been doing. Although there's some friction in this Philippian church going on as well. There's something going on between some factions in the congregation. When Paul wrote this letter, he was in prison. The experts think probably in Rome. And Paul makes it clear in the letter that he doesn't know what's going to happen to him. He doesn't know if he'll get out of prison alive. He doesn't know if he'll see them again. And yet he expresses confidence, as Paul usually does, that he knows how this story ends. Ultimately, the way this story ends is that Christ will be known. So I'm going to read today, translation's kind of an issue in this passage. I'm going to read to you from The Message, which is a contemporary translation by the Presbyterian minister Eugene Peterson. I think there are some things he puts very nicely in his translation. We'll talk about some of that. So let me read you Philippians 2, verses 1 to 13 from The Message. If you've gotten anything at all out of following Christ, if his love has made any difference in your life, if being in a community of the Spirit means anything to you, if you have a heart, if you care, then do me a favor. Agree with each other. Love each other. Be deep-spirited friends. Don't push your way to the front. Don't sweet-talk your way to the top. Put yourself aside and help others get ahead. Don't be obsessed with getting your own advantage. Forget yourselves long enough to lend a helping hand. Think of yourselves the way Christ Jesus thought of himself. He had equal status with God, but didn't think so much of himself that he had to cling to the advantages of that status no matter what. Not at all. When the time came, he set aside the privileges of deity and took on the status of a slave. Became human. Having become human, he stayed human. It was an incredibly humbling process. He didn't claim special privileges. Instead, he lived a selfless, obedient life and then died a selfless, obedient death, and the worst kind of death at that, a crucifixion. Because of that obedience, God lifted him high and honored him far beyond anyone or anything ever, so that all created beings in heaven and on earth, even those long ago dead and buried, will bow in worship before this Jesus Christ and call out in praise that he is the master of all, to the glorious honor of God the Father. What I'm getting at, friends, is that you should simply keep on doing what you've done from the beginning. When I was living among you, you lived in responsive obedience. And now that I'm separated from you, keep it up. Better yet, redouble your efforts. Be energetic in your life of salvation, reverent and sensitive before God. That energy is God's energy, an energy deep within you, God himself willing and working at what will give him the most pleasure. Okay. While leaning into my strong Trinitarian impulse, I found naturally 3 points that I want to make. Lift out of this story for our consideration, out of this letter. The first point is that the way to make a community is to forget our own interests and choose to do what's in the interest of others. The second point is that when Jesus chose humility, he was reflecting the nature of God. And the third point is that the reason that we too might be able to choose humility is because God is at work in us to make it possible. This passage is actually pretty heavy, theologically speaking. So let's tackle the first thing first, and that is point number 1, put others first. Maybe that's a definition of humility. There are a couple places where the translation of a few words in this passage are debated, and sometimes the translator's choice may block us from understanding very clearly what it is that Paul is saying. And in this first section, verses 1 through 5, we usually get in English the word if. And we get this in Peterson too. If you've gotten anything out of following Christ, or as the NIV puts it, if you have any encouragement, then do the following. But there's a good case to be made that that if should really be translated as since, which is one of the alternative English synonyms for the word if. Since you've gotten something out of following Christ, since you have had encouragement from Christ, do this. Because Paul does assume that this is a current situation, not something hypothetical, and that the people listening to him do know that they have gotten something out of following Christ. So since they have, this is what they should do. They both should and they can choose, and Paul seems to make it clear that it is a choice. They can choose to live this way in community, to put others first, to be humble as Christ was humble. So what are the steps? Well, to remind us what the translation says, agree with each other, love each other. Interesting that that one comes after agree with each other. Be deep-spirited friends. Don't push your way to the front. Don't sweet-talk your way to the top. Help others get ahead. Forget yourself long enough to lend a helping hand. So humility, which doesn't mean, I think, having no regard for yourself, but it does mean having special regard for others. And why should we be like this, according to Paul in his letter to the Philippians? Well, it's interesting. Paul doesn't offer us anything in exchange for choosing to put others first. He doesn't say we'll get rich. He doesn't say we'll get ahead. I don't think he even really says we'll get to heaven. He suggests that we sort of have to choose to be this way because Christ's love has made a difference in our lives and because being in a community of the Spirit does matter to us. So I think that Paul is pretty much saying this is the way that we can be a community. And if we don't choose this way, individually, to put others first, then we won't have a community or a communion with each other. Well, this is countercultural stuff, as we all know, right? I mean, how many sayings do we have about the power of pride? I think it's actually a bumper sticker. I have yet to see a bumper sticker that says the power of humility. So it's a challenge. The second point, Christ-like humility reflects the nature of God. This is revealed in this second part of this passage for today, verses 6 through 11, which is actually Paul quoting a hymn that already was known in his time. It's a hymn about Jesus, about Jesus taking on the form of a human being, humbling himself. Even now in the church, it's often read on Palm Sunday, this passage, when Jesus is riding into Jerusalem on his humble donkey. So it's a quotation about a Christ-like humility. Well, let's look at verse 6, because this one really packs a punch. In the Message translation, Peterson says, he, meaning Jesus, had equal status with God, but didn't think so much of himself that he had to cling to the advantages of that status no matter what. So we get a but. Jesus had equal status with God, but didn't cling to it. In the New Revised Standard Version, which we usually use in our church, that but is a though. Though he was in the form of God, he didn't regard equality with God as something to be exploited. But what's probably better than either of those, in this case, is the NIV translation, which leaves out both the but and the though, which many translators now say is correct. And this really makes a difference, because here's what we get if you leave out those words. Jesus, who, being in the very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be grasped. So the point here is, what's at stake is the question of God's nature, really, since we're being told that Jesus had equal status with God, was in very nature God, was in the form of God. Jesus points us always to what God is like. If we want to know what God is like, we look to Jesus. So when Jesus chose to put others first, when Jesus chose humility, that is, when he did not take advantage of his status, when he did not grasp at his equality with God, it's not in spite of the fact that he had God's nature in him. It's because he did. That's what God is like. Christ's humility, in which he always comes down to our level, in which he takes on our form and bears our predicaments, it's the same thing that God himself has done. Now, the fancy theological word for this is kenosis, K-E-N-O-S-I-S, kenosis, which means self-emptying. Lots of stuff has been written about that word. When God created the world, after all, he did it for us, and he gave it to us. What motivated him was love for us, and for us he risked it all. William Greenway says it like this: if a single image could capture the character of God in the first creation account, it would be a gracious bow. All of God's acts, blessings, and delights in creating are for others. That's what God is like. He pours himself out for us again and again, and that's what Jesus is like throughout his ministry, and especially at its climax. And here's the punchline. That's what Paul says plainly is what we must choose to be like too. So point number 3, how are we supposed to do that? How are we supposed to have any hope of pouring ourselves out for others? Because it's not just in our world of 2020, the United States, that acting humbly, putting others first, voluntarily making less of ourselves is not a good way to get ahead. It's not a good way to get rich. It wasn't really a good way to get ahead in the first century either. That's why people didn't choose to do it. I mean, once in a while maybe, but as a regular way of life? Even if we really see that this is the way that community is made, this is the way of the Christ we claim to love, we know deep inside we can't consistently do this. How could we ever hope to? Where would we get the energy? Well, here's how. Look at the last verse of this passage. That's verse 13. Peterson puts it this way: that energy is God's energy, an energy deep within you, God willing and working at what will give him the most pleasure. Or as they put it in the NIV, for it is God who works in you to will and to act according to his good purpose. I think the point is God not only asks it of us, he equips us to do it. God works to give us the will to embrace humility, putting others first for the sake of community, and God works in us so we can follow through in our actions. There's a wonderful cross-reference system in the NIV, and the translators give us other places in the scriptures where the same word is used, or the same concept. And for this passage, Philippians 2:13, it is God who works in you. They send us to Ezra, chapter 1, verse 5. Now, let me tell you, you don't very often get sent to Ezra, an obscure Old Testament book. But what's going on if you go take a look at this place in Ezra? is that the heads of the families of those Jews who have returned from Babylonian exile have resolved to go and rebuild the temple that was destroyed. And the reason that they do that, the verse says, is because they were the people whose hearts God had moved. And that's the point. When God moves our hearts, we can do great things. And according to Paul in his letter to the Philippians, the greatest thing we can do is love our neighbors so much that we put their interests ahead of our own. So go and do likewise. Until we meet again.